The company was worth billions before most people understood what it sold. That wasn't a coincidence. That was the product. Not confusion in the way that startups are sometimes confusing, where the technology is new and the language hasn't caught up yet. This was something more deliberate, more engineered. The complexity wasn't a side effect of innovation. It was an innovation. And the people running it understood that distinction completely, even if they never said it out loud. Here is the thing about confusion that most people miss. In the right environment, confusion doesn't destroy trust. It manufactures it. When something is complicated enough, people stop trying to understand it and start trying to decide whether they trust the person explaining it. That shift from comprehension to faith is one of the most exploitable gaps in human psychology. And once you understand that, you start seeing it everywhere. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning the company wanted you to know, the other one. There's a particular kind of person who builds something like this. They're not usually stupid. In fact, that's almost never the problem. They tend to be intelligent in a very specific way. Skilled at reading rooms, skilled at identifying what audiences want to hear, skilled at translating complicated realities into confident-sounding narratives. They have a talent for making complexity sound like vision. The founder, and there's always a founder in stories like this, started with something real. Most of them do. That's part of what makes it so difficult to trace later. When people ask, where exactly did it go wrong? Because it didn't go wrong at the beginning. At the beginning, there was genuine energy, genuine belief, possibly even genuine capability. But somewhere early, a choice was made. Not a dramatic choice, not a movie villain choice, a quiet one. The choice was this: when the reality got complicated, don't simplify the reality. Simplify the story. It sounds almost reasonable when you say it that way. Founders pitch. That's what they do. You make the complicated thing sound clean. Because investors don't have time for nuance, and nuance doesn't raise money anyway. Everybody does a version of this. The gap between pitch deck and reality is a known gap. It has its own name in startup culture. They call it vision. The problem is what happens next. Once the story works, once investors fund it, once the press covers it, once the logo appears in the right publications, something changes. Not in the company, in the founder. The story starts to feel like the product. This is subtle, but important. When a narrative successfully raises capital, successfully attracts talent, successfully generates press, it produces the same neurological reward that actual results would produce. Your brain doesn't cleanly distinguish between I achieved something and I convinced people I achieved something. The feedback loops are almost identical. And that's where the real drift begins. Because now you have something to protect. The story isn't just a pitch anymore. It's the valuation. It's the credibility. It's the reason the smart people joined. And if the underlying reality starts diverging from the story, if the product is harder than expected, if the margins don't materialize, if the technology has... Now here is where it gets psychologically interesting. Because the founder isn't the only person who needs to believe the story. The people around the founder need to believe it too. And most of them, at least early on, do believe it. That's not naivety. It's a rational response to their situation. Think about what it feels like to join a company with a compelling narrative and a rising valuation. You left something stable. You told people you were betting on something real. Your identity is now partially invested in the company's legitimacy. The last thing your brain wants to do is find evidence that contradicts the narrative you've already paid a social price to believe in. Psychologists call this motivated reasoning. The brain isn't lying to you. It's protecting you. It's filtering information in the direction that costs you the least. And in an environment where the story is the most persuasive thing in the room, Motivated reasoning spreads through an organization the way a habit spreads, quietly, gradually, until it becomes the default setting. This is how companies that are built on confusion get to scale, not through conspiracy, not through coordinated deception at every level, through something far more ordinary. A widespread human tendency to believe what it's convenient to believe, multiplied across hundreds of intelligent, self-interested people, all operating inside the same information environment. The confusion doesn't just protect the company from outside scrutiny, it protects the people inside from their own. But the company can't survive on internal belief alone. It needs external validation. And this is where the system starts to show its real architecture. Enter the institutions. Banks, auditors, analysts, journalists. The sophisticated parties whose job, in theory, is to apply exactly the kind of skeptical scrutiny that would expose the gap between the narrative and reality. Here is the uncomfortable truth about how those institutions actually behave. They are not, in practice, rewarded for skepticism. They are rewarded for relationships, for deal flow, for being seen as constructive partners rather than obstacles. An analyst who publicly questions a high-profile company's fundamentals isn't doing their job better than the analyst who doesn't. They're doing it differently, in a way that tends to produce professional friction, reduced access, and occasionally social humiliation if they're wrong. Because here's the asymmetry. If you're skeptical and you're right, you get a moment of vindication. If you're skeptical and you're wrong, if the company's stock climbs another 40% after you published your concerns, you are the person who missed it. That asymmetry shapes behavior more powerfully than most people are comfortable admitting. So sophisticated institutions, staffed with intelligent people, continued engaging with a company that none of them fully understood. Not because they were foolish, because the incentive to engage was larger than the incentive to interrogate. Because complexity in an environment like this functions as a kind of social force field. It makes criticism feel presumptuous. It makes skeptics look unsophisticated. If you don't understand it, maybe you're not smart enough to understand it. And nobody wants to be the person who said that out loud in the meeting. This is what complexity as camouflage actually looks like in operation. It doesn't need everyone to believe the story. It just needs everyone to be slightly more afraid of disbelieving it than of going along. There were warning signs. There are always warning signs. And the most revealing thing about a story like this is not that warning signs existed, it's that intelligent people saw them and continued anyway. Someone ran the numbers, and the numbers didn't work. Not dramatically wrong, not obviously fraudulent, just quietly inconsistent. The margins that were promised kept getting pushed to the next quarter. The revenue recognition looked creative. The customer contracts, when you read them carefully, had clauses that complicated the simple narrative the company told about them. And people noticed. Inside the company, people noticed. Outside the company, some analysts noticed. Some journalists got close. But noticing and acting on what you notice are two completely different things when the social environment makes action costly. The people inside had stock options. They had mortgages. They had colleagues they liked and believed in. The cost of being the person who raises a formal concern in an organization where the narrative is the product is not abstract. It's concrete. You become difficult. You become a culture risk. You become the person who didn't believe. And in companies like this, not believing is the closest thing to a cardinal sin. So the warning stayed quiet, not because everyone was corrupt, but because everyone was human. Meanwhile, the external narrative continued to compound. This is the mechanism that people underestimate most. Once a company achieves a certain level of prestige, once it's been covered approvingly in the right publications, once credible names have attached themselves to it, once the valuation creates its own gravitational field, the narrative becomes partially self-sustaining. Other credible parties associate with it not because they've independently verified its claims, but because other credible parties have already associated with it. This is social proof operating at institutional scale, and it's extraordinarily powerful because in a world of limited time and unlimited complexity, credibility signals are how sophisticated parties actually make decisions most of the time. The company didn't need to fool everyone from scratch. It needed to fool enough of the right people that everyone else would take their cue from those people. After that, the work was mostly maintenance. Maintain the language, maintain the access, maintain the story. And for a while, sometimes a surprisingly long while, that's enough. But here is the thing about systems built on confusion rather than value. They have a specific vulnerability that systems built on value don't. They cannot survive contact with clarity. Not the dramatic clarity of a full exposure. That comes later. The first dangerous thing is smaller. It's a single person, somewhere in the system, who asks a question that requires a clear answer and does not accept complexity as a substitute. Sometimes it's a journalist with the specific neurological stubbornness to keep pulling at a thread that everyone else has left alone. Sometimes it's a short seller with financial skin in the game, and therefore a much stronger incentive to ignore the social cost of skepticism. Sometimes it's a regulator who, for whatever reason, decides this is the case they're going to actually examine. And when that contact happens, when the machinery is finally required to produce clear answers to clear questions, the answers don't come. They can't come, because the machinery was never built to produce answers. It was built to produce the impression of answers. This is the moment. Not dramatic in the way that movies make it, usually quieter. A meeting where someone asks something ordinary and the ordinary answer doesn't arrive. A document request that produces more documents than anyone can read, but fewer answers than anyone needs. A number that doesn't reconcile. One thread. And the narrative, which was always the structure holding everything together, begins to unstitch. What follows is usually described as a collapse, but that framing misses something important. The real value, whatever real value existed, doesn't disappear in a collapse. It was never as large as the narrative claimed it was. What collapses is the narrative premium, the gap between what the company was actually worth and what the story said it was worth. And depending on how long the story ran, that gap can be enormous. This is the moment when people who were inside the story suddenly find themselves outside it, looking at the same facts they always had access to, wondering how it wasn't obvious. And the honest answer, which few people actually say out loud, is it was obvious. Or at least it was visible. The question was never visibility. The question was incentive. The people who lost money didn't lose it because they were deceived in the simple sense. They lost it because they were participants in a system where believing the narrative was professionally and socially rational, right up until the moment it wasn't. And that shift, from rational to catastrophically wrong, happens fast. Because it was never about fundamentals. It was always about belief. When belief goes, everything goes at once.
Here is where most stories about companies like this end. The collapse is documented. Consequences are distributed unevenly. A few people face legal accountability. Most don't. New regulations are proposed. Some are passed. The press writes the post-mortem. Business schools turn it into a case study. And then, quietly, the same mechanisms reassemble somewhere else. Because the lesson that most people take from a story like this is that company was dishonest.
And the correct lesson, the one that's much more uncomfortable to sit with, is that company was logical. It was logical given the incentives. It was logical given what institutions actually reward versus what they claim to reward. It was logical given what sophisticated investors actually use as a proxy for quality versus what they tell